finished another book on my bucket list. This one was Jane Eyre, written by Charlotte Brontë, performed by Thandiwe Newton, I think is how you say it. It was on Audible. It wasn't audiobook. It was a long one. It was, let's see. Oh, I have to add it all up. I don't know. It was fairly long though. I thought it was okay. It started out really good, but the ending, literally the last like 3 chapters, I really, really did not like. So it starts out with Jane. She's about 9 years old ish, and she's in the care of her aunt. Her parents have both died, and her father has asked her aunt, so his father's sister, to look after Jane. And her aunt just despises her. I think it was something to do with Jane's mother was of lowly born or something like that. So her aunt just hates her and is constantly needling her and just being a prick. This goes on for a bit. It's just kind of an introduction to how Jane was raised. The whole book, there really isn't any direction to it. It's more of a story of the story of a young lady as she tries to find her way through the world, and gives kind of an explanation or a telling of her past and what brought her to certain points in her life. So it's kind of, I don't want to say it's meandering, because it's well structured. I mean, the author is fantastic. She uses a few words a little frequently, and if you read it, you'll know what I'm talking about. But it's there's no notes when it comes with writing and prose and all that stuff. She's an excellent author. So Jane and her aunt do not get along, and her aunt eventually says, "I can't stand you here," basically, and he tells Jane she's much too stubborn to basically she won't let her aunt push her around, and that really peeves her aunt. I'm not good with names, so I really only remember Jane and a few other characters. But so she sends her to a boarding school, and she sends a letter asking the boarding school to take Jane, and she says in the letter that Jane is deceitful, dishonest, and just not a very good kid. And this, of course, sets Jane off, because she's none of those things. She's very polite, she's kind. She's all around a good girl. And so the last meeting with her aunt, she tells her that everyone she meets and speaks to, if they ask about her aunt, she will tell them that her aunt is a cruel woman, one who gave her nothing, who did not love her, who spat on her, basically. And this, of course, makes her aunt mad, but they part ways. Jane goes to the boarding school. I have notes, 1 second. Okay, yeah. So she goes to boarding school, and Mr. Brocklehurst, what a great name. And Mr. Brocklehurst is the dean, essentially. I think he's part of the church, and part of the church pays for the whole thing. So as long as the attendees, if they have wealthy benefactors like Jane does, usually they'll give them some money as a thank you. But besides that, it's all paid for by the church. It's an all-girls school, except for Mr. Brocklehurst, who's not there very often. He's just kind of overseeing it. This book was also written back in like 1800s. No, that's not right. 1800. So is that 1900s? Whatever. Math is hard. And he believes Jane's aunt, but the rest of the school is more willing to look at Jane's actions and determine for themselves what kind of person Jane is. Like I said, this is just kind of a retelling of the story. There's no objective. There's no really like moral teaching that something like Ernest Hemingway's Old Man and the Sea might have, or like hidden meaning. It's just kind of Jane as she goes out through her life. So she's a student there, and she meets who she would probably consider to be her first real friend. She's a quiet girl. I can't remember her name, but she's a quiet girl, and we learn that she has a disease. We're not sure what it is, but it's terminal. This is something that kind of confused me through the whole book, because Jane and her friend, they love each other very much. You can tell. Sisterly love, right? And at the end of their relationship, Jane ends up, like she sneaks into the nursery, or not nursery, the infirmary, and she meets her friend as she's basically dying, and they end up sleeping one night together, and her friend dies, and Jane's just, asleep in her arms. Very sweet. But after she dies, there really isn't any mention of this friend anymore. And it really made me sad, because even throughout the rest of the book, like this happens in the first like quarter, maybe a little further, first third of the book. And you'd think that this would be, at the very least, an extremely important part of her life. But after her friend dies, it really isn't mentioned very much. I was kind of saddened by that. Like, I can remember the first couple friends. I've never had too many friends, but I can remember that, like, the first, I met one in preschool, and I'd say the second one I met was in, like, third grade. I don't have many friends, like I said. And I don't talk to either of them anymore, but I still remember them. I still think about them every now and then. I still remember their names. And it was weird that Jane's friend never came back up for the rest of the story. She did say that she was very sad. Of course, she's devastated after her friend dies. But again, it's just, I don't know. That kind of bothered me. Anyways, Jane finishes schooling and she becomes a teacher at the school. The students seem to like her. The rest of the, what's it called? Her co-workers? What do you call it? The school staff, whatever you call them. They seem to like her. She's a good teacher, good person. Eventually she decides to, she doesn't want to keep living in the same loop. She doesn't really want to stay grounded or stay chained, I don't know, to the boarding school. So she scrapes together some money and she puts an ad in the paper and she becomes a governess. A governess would be a private tutor specifically to one wealthy family, and then she would live in the family's home. Like I said, this is written in, 1810 or something, so all very old and proper. She gets one, I'm trying to remember this. It's funny because I just read it, but So she gets one response, and it's from Thornfield Hall. Mr. I want to say Mr. Rockefeller. That's not right. Is that right? No, Rockefeller is the American billionaire. Did I say Rochester, or did I say... I said Rockefeller, didn't I? It's Rochester. Which is funny, because that's a town in southern Minnesota that I've been to multiple times. I have some friends that live there, actually. Anyways, so Mr. Rochester. She goes there. She becomes the governess to they call her a bastard child. She's again, 6 or 9 year old. Oh, let's see, where is it? Small French girl. Is it Sophie? It might be Sophie. Mr. Rochester gives us a story later on. Basically, she was, Mr. Rochester loved a woman, and the woman was unfaithful and had a child with another man. Rochester wasn't married to her, though. So it wasn't really like, it wasn't an affair. There you go. And they blamed him that it was his daughter. And then he, being, I guess, a kind man, decided to take her in as his own. I don't know. That's what he says, so I don't know if I believe it. He does seem to be an honest man, but the story is only told from one way, so I don't know. I don't know if that's true. Anyways, she's a very sweet girl, and the person who did the reading of the book makes her sound very cute, and she has this wonderful French accent. As Jane Eyre, one of Jane Eyre's jobs is to teach her English, since they're from England and blah blah blah. Very sweet, and she kind of loves her as almost like a mother. It's very sweet. Anyways, over time she meets Mr. Rochester, and they fall in love. Now this, like I said, again, the book doesn't really seem to have an endpoint. It just kind of goes. To me, this was a little weird, because I really respect and I really enjoyed the story of her lifting herself out of her aunt's grasp, and then going to boarding school, creating a name for herself and respect from her peers, and then taking herself another step further into her own employment at Mr. Rochester's at Thornfield. And she's a strong woman. It's impressive. I don't do that. I can't do that. And then she falls in love with him, and to me that just felt strange. For one, because she's like 18 and he's like 40-ish. That's a little weird. And then the other reason would be, as kind as he seemed to be, he also feels a bit manipulative. Especially, see, here's the rub. And big spoilers, by the way, big spoilers. Here's the rub, though. So it turns out that he is still married. And, this is back when that's very offensive to God and to the people and whatnot. But not only is he married, but he lives with his wife in Thornfield Hall. And she is clinically insane, and he has locked her up in there. Just hasn't told anybody about it. Even Jane, for living there for 2 years, didn't know about her. So he's attempting to make Jane his mistress. And of course this was big news. This was all discovered at their wedding, as they were getting married, or about to get married. Of course Jane was not happy. Mr. Rochester was begging her to stay. But she made and she really does sound like she loved him. It really did. But she made the very difficult decision to break off their engagement. And one night she fled Thornfield. I really like this part too. It felt like she had escaped the clutches of maybe not a deceitful man. He wasn't deceitful, nor was he. He felt manipulative, but he wasn't. He didn't seem like he was doing it out of vice or out of any sadistic desires, right? It also felt like they didn't love each other. She broke off and she fled, and using her last of her money, she found a preacher. I'm not sure what they call him, but a preacher. And after living with them for a bit, they took her in because she's poor. After living for them, they took her in because she's poor, because she had no money. And after living with him and his two sisters for a bit, he gave her a job to teach the country folk, the farming folk, whatever you want to call them, to teach, because they had a boys' school and he wanted to open a girls' school. So she taught the farmers' daughters and all that stuff. Then it was discovered that they are actually part of the same family. So suddenly Jane has a family, and their uncle had died, and their uncle had left all the money. I think it was £20,000. I don't know how much that is in today's money, but he left £20,000 to Jane, specifically Jane, and Jane, being the kind woman she was, she split it evenly between her and now her two sisters and brother. I think they're cousins and stuff, but whatever. For this story, their siblings is actually, it's not good enough. I'll tell you in a bit. And again, the story just kind of meanders. It just kind of goes. It just kind of talks. It's all very. It's nice. There really isn't an end goal. There really isn't a overarching story. The brother, though, wants to go on a missionary to, I believe, India. And he asks Jane to marry him. I don't know how far the cousinary stuff goes, but that is a bit weird. Also because he doesn't, I can't tell, because there's a woman in the area that he loves, and who also loves him. But he can't marry her because he's a part of the clergy. I believe he's sworn to remain pure. But then he asks Jane to marry. I don't really get the rules. I don't really know what's going on, to be honest. But Jane refuses. This drives a rift between them. One night, she decides she needs to see Mr. Rochester again. And so she flees the church, she flees the school, and she goes back to Thornfield. This is what I really didn't like. Because she goes back to Mr. Rochester. And it just didn't feel right to me. Like, why did she go back? I guess because she loved him, but I don't know. It just doesn't really make sense to me. So she goes back. She finds that the Thornfield Hall is burned down. Mr. Rochester's wife had set fire to the building, then thrown herself off the roof and perished. Mr. Rochester had attempted to save both his now late wife and all the servant folk. The servants all got out, except obviously Mrs. Rochester did not. And as he was retreating from the building, it collapsed on him and took one of his eyes, burned the other so he could not see, and it took off, I believe, his right hand. So he was not having a good time. Jane finds this all out, speaking to, I think, a tavern owner. And she finds where finds where Rochester is living. She goes there, meets him. He's obviously massively depressed. And they reunite. And then Jane convinces him to ask her to marry. She convinces him, so he asks, no, how do I say this? She convinces Mr. Rochester to ask her to marry him. Does that make sense? I think so. And, of course, she says yes. And then they live in this little farm. It's not clear if they live in the farm house, because he's being taken care of, a farmer and his wife. Because Mr. Rochester was very wealthy. So I'm not really sure where they end up living, but Jane takes over the care of Mr. Rochester, and they bring back Sophie, Rochester's ward, and Jane considers her to be a daughter, and then Jane bears Rochester a daughter as well, or a child. I can't remember if it was a daughter or not. And that's the end of the book. And I found that to be very bizarre, because that is not the ending I was expecting. I was not expecting her to marry her cousin, either, but I was expecting her to move out of the church and go somewhere else. And, I don't know, build something with all she's put together. I don't know. Like I said, I loved the first few bits. Everything up to the last 3 chapters where she returns to Mr. Rochester. Just didn't feel right. Maybe that's kind of the point, though. It was a story of how she ended up with him. Maybe that's why it was written. They say there's many different types of love. A lot of them people might not understand. I guess I don't understand this one. I don't know. It's a very strange romance book. It's not bad, but it's different. I don't know. Okay. Well, that's about it. So, good night.